This paper looks at the rise of the militant shop stewards movement on construction sites in the United Kingdom in the 1960s and charts the class response over many decades since by the practice of blacklisting of active trade unionists involved in those struggles, a process in which the whole panoply of the capitalist state was drawn upon and is being drawn upon by the bourgeois class. It then charts the unravelling of this conspiracy and the fight back to expose the class nature of justice in the context of a capitalist society. Now, as we all know, at most places of work where workers have organised themselves into trade unions, they've gradually built up better wages and conditions of employment over decades than exist in non-unionised workplaces. Workers build on what's been achieved in the past, or in the current neoliberal climate of austerity, at least defend to some extent what has been gained. But as Jeff said in his presentation, trade unionists, like socialists, are standing on the shoulders of giants. What's been achieved over the last 200 years, we're trying to build on. Now, the construction industry is very different. It's always been very different. Building sites by their very nature are transitory places of work. Most labour is hired on a job-by-job basis and dispensed with at the end of contracts. This casualisation has meant that national agreements have always provided only a very basic set of standards, wages and conditions of employment. When an active trade unionist gets employment on a new site, he or she usually tries to recruit everyone into a trade union and seek recognition from the employers for collective bargaining purposes on that site. Those activists are then invariably elected to represent their fellow workers in negotiations with their employers, and these local negotiations often used to centre, if they don't any longer, on incentive payments. So shop stewards, not full-time officials, thus were put in the front line of the struggle for better wages, often being able to double or even treble workers' wages above increasingly irrelevant national rates of pay. It's against this background that by the 1960s, 95% of strikes on building sites were unofficial, called by site stewards rather than by union leaderships. Shop stewards were also central in negotiating better site conditions, severance pay agreements, health and safety agreements, and so on. Of course, some sites only lasted, and still only last, a short time. And by the time they'd done all this, active trade unionists usually had to start all over again on another site with another employer. However, from the 1960s onwards, construction companies began to employ industrial relations officers on a more regular basis. Now, their main purpose, it seemed, was to keep active trade unionists who were successful at negotiating better pay and conditions off of their projects as a rising tide of militancy began to sweep across Britain's construction sites. Their major resource for vetting job applicants, and I say vetting because that's the term they use rather than blacklisting, not on the basis of people's ability to do the work that jobs required, but on the basis of their trade union and political affiliations and activities, was the totally illegal Economic League secret list of active trade unionists and socialists. In the 1960s, Labour research uncovered and published details of the staggering scale of the Economic League blacklisting activities, which I won't go into because I haven't got time. But no criminal investigations were launched and no criminal charges were brought against the organisation for this activity. So apart from the moral censure of the left, the Economic League continued to be free to carry on with their nefarious activities. During the 1960s, the employers also increased their use of what's called lump labour. Now, the lump is an expression which refers to labour-only subcontracting, where a lump sum is paid for set amounts of work on a self-employed basis. And I put self-employed in inverted commas. This was attractive for workers because They could avoid paying income tax and national insurance because the payments were often cash in hand, and some workers obviously welcomed this. But many other workers were forced to work on the lump. Employers could avoid their responsibilities for tax, national insurance, holiday pay, sick pay and so on, and also offload responsibility for health and safety and the training of apprentices to the self-employee, who rarely trained anybody. Employers could also pay lucrative lump sums to attract workers in boom years, but slash prices during periodic slumps. This was the totally free market for labour. But the main advantage for employers was that workers were not covered as employees by employment law with regard to trade union activity, so could be dismissed at a minute's notice on a whim. Hence, rank and file trade unionists and trade union leaders in principle anyway, always opposed the lump because it undermined their ability to organise in the industry. Now it's in this context that the militant shop stewards movement in the 1960s represented a concerted attempt at site level to qualitatively change the conditions under which building workers toiled. Now the seeds of this militancy were evident in a national building strike over pay and hours in 1963, which involved 60,000 workers striking on over 800 sites. Also, many bitter disputes on individual sites took place over Victorian site conditions, poor health and safety, bogus incentive schemes, and the attempt by employers to spike this newfound militancy by the use of lump labour. None more so than at two sites in London. One was Horseferry Road site, where there was the construction of new government buildings, but more especially at the Barbican development. The Barbican development was central to a wave of militancy that swept across construction sites throughout Britain in the mid to late 60s, especially in the larger cities. It was started in 1962. It was a 40-acre development of housing, landscaping, a business centre, a school, and obviously, what most people know it for, one of the largest arts centres in Europe. It employed over 1,000 building workers at its peak in the mid-60s. Now, whilst not entirely new, non-traditional constructions dominated the project. Increased mechanisation, increased complexity, new methods of construction, and the use of new technologies increased the use of new non-traditional occupations. The use of in-situ concrete in particular dramatically increased the employment of non-traditional trades such as steel fixers and concrete finishers who were not members of traditional right-wing craft unions. This, coupled with the tenor of the times and the initial grim site conditions, gave the impetus for a new militant trade unionism. Led and coordinated by several militant shop stewards who were mostly, though not exclusively, members of the Communist Party of Great Britain, workers launched numerous challenges to the status quo for building workers, especially between 1965 and 1967 on the tariff development, which was phase 1 and phase 2. Following a dispute over the use of subcontractors, in 1965 the whole workforce of the contractor tariff was sacked and new workers were each required to sign the so-called document, which promised never to take any industrial action. This provoked widespread support for the strikers from sites across Britain, especially in Liverpool and Manchester. In London, 2,000 building workers on the capital's 4 next biggest building sites walked out in sympathy. This proved to be the embryo from which developed the militant organisation, the London Joint Sites Committee. After a long and bitter struggle, the employers' tariff eventually conceded defeat. Despite this phase of the development continuing to be marked by disputes over incentive payments and the sacking of stewards, This was the biggest battle over the direction of industrial relations on UK building sites for many years. However, bigger battles were still to come. In 1966, on phase 4 of the development, the company Mighton also faced industrial action when they tried to bring in steel fixers working on the lump. Mighton locked out the whole workforce for 13 months. The strikers were supported by workers on sites in all parts of London, in Manchester, in Glasgow and Liverpool, by the raising of strike funds and by the sending of coachloads of supporters to pickets and demonstrations that were called by the strikers. This resulted in 1967, in June 1967, in a court of inquiry being set up by the government under the Industrial Courts Act. Despite overwhelming evidence at the inquiry that design and tendering mistakes had contributed greatly to the problems and delays on site, something that Mighton admitted themselves, blame was wholly attributed by the inquiry to the Works Committee. This was supported by a campaign of vilification of the site stewards by the national press, in particular vilification of the convener steward Lou Lewis. The Cameron Report, as it became known, recommended that trade union leaders ignore democratic site processes and appoint new shop stewards so that the site could be reopened with the existing stewards remaining sacked. Union leaders who thought that the shop stewards were undermining their authority supported these recommendations and even took out full-page advertisements in national newspapers saying that there was no strike at the Barbican and that trade unionists were free to work there with the support of their organisations. Additionally, 2 of the sacked stewards were expelled from their craft union, the Amalgamated Society of Woodworkers, for continuing to picket the site. When trade union officials accompanied Mighton managers on a mission to reopen the site, they were confronted by a picket of several hundred and pelted with mud. In addition, the workers on Mighton were supported unanimously by all the workers working for Turriff and Lang, the other 2 main contractors. On the 16th of October, a huge police presence forced the reopening of the site against a 400-strong picket. At a later mass meeting, the Works Committee accepted the defeat in the face of the overwhelming force of the state, trade union officials and the employers. Lou Lewis, the sacked convener steward, presciently told the 400 assembled workers that it was the trade union leadership that must now be destroyed. The employers publicly announced the blacklisting of the sacked stewards. No legal action was taken against them for this. All the stewards from the Barbican and Horseshoe Road sites, as well as trade unionists from other sites that had supported them across the country, were blacklisted and found themselves unable to secure employment, even in other unrelated industries. This was the start of a massive increase in the use of the blacklist. Building site militancy continued to escalate, and as a result of the cooperation of rank and file building workers across Britain in supporting the Barbican dispute, the London Joint Sites Committee joined up with site committees in Manchester and Liverpool and launched the Building Workers' Charter in April 1970 with numerous demands. The Building Workers' Charter expanded eventually to having 7 area committees based in Glasgow, London, Manchester, Wigan, Leicester, Stoke and North Wales. By 1972, the Charter newspaper, which was edited by Lou Lewis, was selling 10,000 copies per issue. In the summer of 1972, workers on big sites up and down the country refused to accept a national deal negotiated by their unions. Led by Building Workers' Charter, activists, many of whom had worked on Barbican and Horseshoe Road developments, persuaded workers on large sites to come out on strike and to organise flying pickets to go to other sites across Britain to persuade workers to join them. Eventually, every major site in Britain was closed down and the union leaders had no option but to make the strikes official and to withdraw their acceptance of the employer's offer. After 12 weeks of a shutdown on virtually every major site in Britain, the Employers' Federation capitulated and offered a 30% increase in the basic rate of pay and other better conditions. The unions recommended a return to work, and although there was a return to work, many rank and file workers, especially those in Building Workers' Charter, thought that the fight should have carried on until the lump had been totally eradicated. Nevertheless, the employers were bitter and decided to get their revenge. Long after the strike was over, representatives of the major contracting companies met with Conservative government ministers, with senior police officers, members of the security services and representatives of the upper echelons of the judiciary to hatch a plan to charge a number of building workers from the northwest for common law conspiracy. An employer's dossier on picketing during the strike, which included sensationalised press cuttings from the right-wing press, was sent to the then Conservative Home Secretary Robert Carr. Before the building work strike had even started, Carr had circulated a statement to chief constables throughout the country telling them to take a harder line on picketing. Robert McAlpine, of McAlpines, also wrote to the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Sir Robert Mark, complaining about the lack of enforcement of the law at Shrewsbury. Mark gave his support, describing the Shrewsbury pickets' crimes as worse even than murder. The High Sheriff of Denbighshire, who, not incidentally, was the 9th member of the McAlpine family to have held that post, also gave his support. The Home Secretary then pressurised the police to arrest and charge those who had taken part in picketing at Shrewsbury. Despite all these men having been congratulated at the time of the picketing by police officers on the ground for their impeccable behaviour, 35 were arrested.
Got 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. 11 were acquitted at Mould Crown Court, but then they changed the rules so that the Lord Chancellor intervened to abolish the defence's ability to challenge jurors. The day before the prosecution of the final 24, the day before they completed their case, ITV screened a 60-minute documentary entitled Reds Under the Bed, which showed supposed violence by pickets and closed with a Conservative MP talking about violence in the building workers' strike. Despite the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Information Research Department, IRD, admitting having had a hand in this programme, 2 of the defendants being shown in the programme taking part in protest marches and the images being interspersed with footage of damage on building sites alleged to have been caused by the trade unionists, the judge dismissed complaints that this amounted to contempt of court. In 2015, just 6 months ago, Labour MP Andy Burnham revealed to Parliament previously secretly held files that a government conspiracy to frame and jail the strikers, including commissioning and promoting the ITV documentary, involved the secret services, senior police officers, government ministers and even the Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath. Another document reveals that the then Conservative Home Secretary, Robert Carr, actually directed police evidence gathering. Furthermore, another file on a meeting between chief constables and prosecuting lawyers documents inconvenient witness statements being destroyed. It said that this was needed because the statements were taken before officers taking the statements knew what we were trying to prove. At the trial, the jurors were also given assurances that if the defendants were found guilty, they would most likely just get small fines. Many of the jurors were said to look deeply shocked at the sentences that were handed out. John Mackenzie Jones was given 6 months jail sentence, Ricky Tomlinson given 2 years in prison, and Des Warren was given 3 years, all of them having been reduced on appeal. As Des Warren said from the dock at the time, the only conspiracy that had taken place was a conspiracy by the capitalist class. This was despite the judge laughably warning Warren that this was not a political trial and that he should not use the opportunity to address the jury to make a political speech. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. I've loads more stuff that brings us right up to date because the blacklist was finally exposed in 2009. I am currently one of about 480 people that were on that blacklist, and even though I've been working in higher education for the last 30 years, my name was still on the blacklist in 2009. I'm currently taking high court action against the employers with 480 other building workers for misuse of personal information. But anybody that wants to ask me about that can tell you more about that later. Thank you very much.